Welcome to the training module for the Children's Communication Checklist 2, produced by Sarah Baker and Maddie Lorenzen. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, we are going to ask 5 multiple-choice pre-training questions. These questions will be answered throughout our module training, but we want to address them at the beginning to support understanding prior to instruction. The questions we are asking are as follows. Number 1. The area of language related to social skills is A. Semantics, B. Syntax, C. Pragmatics, or D. Phonology. Number 2. The CCC-2 is intended for A. Adults, B. Children, C. Adolescents, or D. Both B and C. Number 3. The CCC-2 identifies children who may A. Have a pragmatic language impairment, B. Have speech and language impairments, C. Need further evaluation for autism spectrum disorders, or D. All of the above. Number 4. The CCC-2 can be administered in A. 20 to 30 minutes, B. 1 to 5 minutes, C. 1 hour, or D. 10 to 15 minutes. Number 5. The CCC-2 response form should be answered by A. the physician, B. the child, C. the caregiver, or D. the psychologist. Now that we highlighted our pre-training questions, let's move forward with our module. The Children's Communication Checklist 2, or the CCC-2, is designed to assess children's communication skills in the areas of pragmatics, syntax, morphology, semantics, and speech. This checklist in particular delves into the area of pragmatics, which are the rules for social language. Pragmatics are context-driven and involve the use of appropriate messages and interpretation within that context. This is the area of language related to social skills, which answers question 1 in our pre-check. It's important to understand pragmatics and the role it has on communication. According to the CCC-2 manual, children with speech and language impairments are at risk for long-term social difficulties, which can impact their day-to-day lives. This leads us to our second pre-check question. This assessment measure is important in the identification of children with pragmatic language impairment, children who may have speech and language impairments, and children who may need further assessment for autism spectrum disorders. As previously stated, this measure looks at multiple areas of language, and although pragmatics are a key component of this assessment, this can be used as a screener for children who are suspected of having speech and language impairments. This is also an important tool that can be included in the assessment battery of an individual suspected of having autism. The CCC-2 is used in children ages 4 to 16 and 11 months. If we reflect back on our pre-check questions, it's important to know that this checklist can be used with preschool-aged children up until adolescence. This measure does not look at the communication skills that are seen in toddlers or anyone ages 17 and up. Along with this age range, these participants must also meet a set of criteria. They have to speak English as their primary language, use sentences, and do not have a permanent hearing loss. We are now going to address the third question provided in our pre-training. The CCC-2 is administered using a caregiver response form. This is designed for an individual who spends the most time with a child. Although this can be completed by teachers, it's considered a limitation since they don't have as much interaction with a child as a caregiver would. When filling out the response form, the caregiver rates the number of times the child demonstrates the communication behavior described in each item. The CCC-2 is also designed for speech-language pathologists, education diagnosticians, and psychologists to use. These are professionals that have knowledge and experience in administering, scoring, and understanding results of standardized assessments. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that an estimated 1 in 68 school-aged children have been identified with autism. With this increased prevalence, it's important for professionals to be informed about the communication challenges that individuals with autism face. According to the CCC-2 manual, children and adolescents diagnosed with ASD have abnormal development in communication, socialization, and imagination. This can impact their ability to interact with others. Individuals with ASD show various levels of cognitive functioning, but all exhibit difficulties with pragmatics regardless of their cognitive skills. The CCC-2 assesses verbal and nonverbal pragmatic challenges that could have a negative impact on social and academic communication. It's important to keep in mind that the CCC-2 cannot be used as a way to diagnose autism, but it can help determine if further evaluation is needed. The CCC-2 consists of 70 items that are divided into 10 scales, each with 7 items. For each scale, 5 items address difficulties in communication skills, while 2 items focus on strengths. The first 4 scales, including speech, syntax, semantics, and coherence, look at articulation, phonology, language structure, and vocab and discourse. The next 4 scales, which are initiation, scripted language, context, and nonverbal communication, look at pragmatic aspects of communication that parents have observed and go beyond measures of standardized language assessments. The last 2 scales, which are social relations and interests, assess behaviors that are usually impaired in children with autism. Here are the 10 scales included in the CCC-2. Scale A is speech, Scale B is syntax, Scale C is semantics, Scale D is coherence, Scale E is initiation, Scale F is scripted language, Scale G is context, Scale H is nonverbal communication, Scale I is social relations, and Scale J is interests. The CCC-2 comes with a manual, caregiver response form, scoring CD, and scoring worksheet. Now we will address the final question in our pre-training questionnaire. The caregiver can complete the response form in 10 to 15 minutes. The actual scoring of the form, which should be done by a trained clinician, can take 5 to 15 minutes. The CCC-2 uses the test-retest reliability measures. The measures had a sample of 98 children, with 52 males and 46 females, who represent a range of racial and ethnic backgrounds. The 98 children were separated into 3 age groups of 30 to 34 children, the age groups being ages 4 to 6 and 11 months, 7 to 9 years and 11 months, and 10 to 16 and 11 months. There was also a range for level of education of caregiver responders. After the first completion, the second completion was done within 1 to 28 days. The reliability coefficient ranges from 0.86 to 0.96, reflecting a strong stability between the 2 ratings. Reliabilities for the general communication composite score range from 0.94 to 0.96, which reflects a very strong reliability. The CCC-2 was developed to display developmental communication abilities of children ages 4 to 16 years and 11 months. The goal for this measure is to have items appropriately cover established areas of communication, with emphasis on social communication or pragmatics. The data for this measure was collected from children with specific language impairment, pragmatic language impairment, and/or autism spectrum disorders. The demographics for this clinical sample were matched to the control sample of typically developing children. The data collected supports for the clinical use of the CCC-2.
Hi.
So today you're going to be filling out the Children's Communication Checklist 2. This is just a questionnaire for you to fill out so that we can get a better idea of Johnny's communication strengths and challenges.
Okay.
This worksheet's meant for the caregiver because you do know best about his communication. You spend the most time with him.
Right.
It's really only intended for someone that spends 3 to 4 days a week with Johnny for the last 3 months consistently, and someone that's comfortable reading English. So do you qualify for both those things? Are you comfortable with that? Awesome.
Yes,
wonderful. So on this front page, you're just going to go through some background information about him and yourself, just to make sure that this is the right checklist for you guys.
Okay.
And then once we open up on this page here, you'll see 50 statements. And you're going to give these 50 statements a rating of 0, 1, 2, or 3.
Okay.
So you'll give a 0 if it's something that you've never seen, a 1 if you see it occasionally or once a week, 2 if it happens frequently or twice a day, and then 3 if this behavior is happening more than twice a day.
Okay. So what if this is a lot of stuff? What if I haven't seen something or...
Right. Okay, absolutely. There's a lot of questions here. So if you're having a hard time with one, just really think back to the last week, and if you've seen that, and if you can't remember, just make your most best guess you can, because every single one of these does need to fill out in order to complete the checklist.
Okay.
And so then on the last page here, there's questions 51 through 70, and these questions focus on the strengths of communication, and you're going to score these with the same rating key of 0, 1, 2, or 3.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
That makes sense.
Awesome. All right, well, this should take you about 15 minutes to complete then.
Okay, thanks. I'll get it done for you.
Included in the Children's Communication Checklist 2 is a scoring CD program. When this program is inserted into a computer, it shows an Excel sheet that calculates scores for you. First, click on the Raw Data tab at the bottom of the screen and enter the child's name, sex, caregiver's name and relationship, date of birth, and date checklist was completed. Next, stay on the Raw Data tab and go through each of the 70 statements in order and input the caregiver's ratings of 0, 1, 2, or 3. If an item was left blank on the caregiver report form, insert a score as 0. If more than 3 items are left blank and cannot be received from the caregiver, the response form is considered invalid and cannot be scored. If a caregiver gives a discrepant score, such as 1.5, round down to the nearest whole number, which in this case would be 1. Once all of the scores have been input, click View, Hide Age, Raw, and Scale Scores. Then select the child's name and click Update Scaled Score. For the program to generate the scaled scores, composite score, index score, and percentile ranks. Lastly, in order to print and save the child's scores, select the child's name and click Create Summary Chart. Click the Summary tab, shown here at the bottom, and the chart will appear. From this page, you are able to print or save the score summary. The Children's Communication Checklist 2 can also be scored by hand using the scoring worksheet. First, transfer identifying information from the caregiver response form to the front page of the scoring worksheet at the top. This includes child's name, the name of the caregiver, and their relationship to the child, child's date of birth, and date the CCC-2 was completed. Calculate the child's chronological age based on the 2 previously stated dates in the top right corner. Next, flip to section 1 of the scoring worksheet and record the caregiver's responses for statements 1 through 50 of 0, 1, 2, or 3 in the corresponding squares. Note that the squares are not in numerical order. Once all of the scores have been transferred, add up each column and write the sum in the corresponding diamond below, labeled subtotal raw scores. The subtotal raw score A is calculated by adding the subtotal raw scores for scales A through J. Write the subtotal raw score A in the box designated. Going down to section 2, continue to record the caregiver's responses for statements 51 through 70 in the corresponding circles. Again, note the circles are not in numerical order. Once all of the scores have been transferred to the scoring worksheet, subtract each score from 3 and write the sum of that equation in the corresponding box. Next, add the 2 corresponding boxes for each column of scales and write the sum in the diamonds below, labeled subtotal raw scores. The subtotal raw score B is calculated by adding the section 2 subtotal raw scores for scales A through J and then written in the corresponding box labeled subtotal raw score B. Next, move on to section 3 where we check for consistency of the scaled scores. If subtotal raw score B is 30 or below, then the scores are considered consistent. If consistency is not found, refer to Appendix E in the CCC-2 manual to verify. If consistency is still not found, after consulting with Appendix E, double-check that all raw scores were copied accurately. Continue with these steps until consistency is found. Once the consistency check is passed, move to Section 4 and take the subtotal raw scores from Section 1 and the subtotal raw scores from Section 2 for scales A through J and add them together to find the total raw scores for speech, syntax, semantics, coherence, initiation, scripted language, context, nonverbal communication, social relations, and interests. Once the sums for each of the total raw scores are found, transfer those scores to the front page of the scoring worksheet under Total Raw Scores. In order to find the scaled scores, use Appendix D in the CCC-2 manual. Locate the column associated with raw scores for scales A through J and look to the left column to find the scaled score. Write each scaled score for each scale in the boxes labeled A through J in the section labeled Scaled Scores on the front page of the scoring worksheet. In order to determine percentile ranks for each scaled score, use Appendix G in the CCC-2 manual. Find the scaled scores for A through J and the correlating percentage rank in the middle column. Record the percentage rank for each scale in the boxes labeled A through J in the percentile rank section on the front page of the scoring worksheet. The general communication composite consists of standard score, confidence interval, and percentile rank. To begin, you must first add the scaled scores for A through H and write the sum of the box in GCC sum of scaled scores. Next, use Appendix F in the CCC-2 manual to determine the GCC standard score, confidence interval, and percentile rank. The GCC sum of scaled scores, which we calculated previously, will be found in the far left column. The corresponding communication composites are listed in the columns to the right. Record the correlating information stated in the table of Appendix F in the boxes indicating GCC standard score, GCC confidence interval, and GCC percentile rank. Be sure to also indicate 90 or 95% in the GCC confidence interval. Lastly, social interaction difference index is determined by first taking the sum of the scaled scores for E, H, I, and J, which is written in the corresponding circles, and the sum of scaled scores A, B, C, and D, which is written in the corresponding circle as well. The sum of A, B, C, and D is then subtracted from the sum of E, H, I, and J. The result of this equation is the social interaction difference index, which is written in the box below SIDI on the bottom right of the scoring worksheet. Once the scores have been calculated using either the scoring CD or the scoring worksheet, we need to make sense of what all those numbers mean. Keep in mind that the caregiver's responses are subjective, so it is suggested that the Children's Communication Checklist 2 is supplemented with other assessments, observations, and reports for a full, well-rounded view of the child's communication abilities. The scale scores are norm-referenced scores derived from the raw score given by the caregiver. The scaled scores have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. The scale score measures include the scales A through J, which are speech, syntax, semantics, coherence, initiation, scripted language, context, nonverbal communication, social relations, and interest. Percentile ranks show where the child stands in comparison to other children their age in the norm group. Scores can range from 0.1 to 99.9 with a mean of 50. This means that if a child receives a percentile rank of 25, they did just as well or better than 25% of the children their age in the norm group. There are age-based percentile ranks for every scaled score A through J, and the general composite score as well. The general communication composite score is a norm referenced with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. It consists of the sum of the scaled scores from 2 or more subtests and is used to compare the child's performance to the performance of other same-age children. The general communication composite scores are provided for scales A through J and include standard score, confidence interval, and percentile rank. The scores are used to identify children that are likely to have significant communication challenges. The social interaction difference index is used to identify children with a communication profile that might be characteristic of a language impairment or autism spectrum disorder. An SIDI of -10 to 10 is considered typical and is where 90% of the normative sample scored. 11 and above indicates that a child may have a diagnosis of specific language impairment, and -11 and below indicates that a child might have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. The SIDI should be used with caution though, because in the norm group there were children diagnosed with SLI or ASD who still scored within the typical range. The SIDI should be used in combination with all scores and not as the final result. Now we will go over some post-training questions and case study questions to test your knowledge of the CCC-2. Case study number 1. Oliver is 8 years old and in 2nd grade. The CCC-2 was completed by his mother. He received a GCC standard score of 100 with a percentile rank of 50 and an SIDI of -15. His language and pragmatic scale scores proved that pragmatics was more challenging than language. He also scored below the expected age level in initiation, social relations, and interests. Question number 1. Based on the information from the scored CCC-2, Oliver presents with A. Typical language development, B. A possible specific language impairment diagnosis, C. A possible autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, or D. A possible pragmatic language impairment diagnosis. The correct answer to question number 1 is C. A possible autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. This is the correct answer because children with ASD typically have more challenges with pragmatics than they do with language, which Oliver's CCC-2 scores implied. Children with ASD also typically score less than 11 on the SIDI, and Oliver scored -15. Children with ASD also usually show lower scores in initiation, social relations, and interests, as Oliver did. Case study number 2. Miley is 11 years old and is in 5th grade. The CCC-2 was completed by her grandmother. She received a GCC standard score of 93 with a percentile rank of 32 and an SIDI of 14. Her language and pragmatic scores proved that language was more challenging than pragmatics. Question number 2. Based on the scoring from the CCC-2, Miley presents with A. Typical language development, B. A possible specific language impairment diagnosis, C. A possible autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, or D. A possible pragmatic language impairment diagnosis. The correct answer to question number 2 is B. A possible specific language impairment diagnosis. This is the correct answer for Miley because children with specific language impairments usually have greater challenges with language than with pragmatics. Children with SLI also usually score less than 100 on the GCC and typically score 11 or higher on the SIDI, as Miley did. Question number 3. If a caregiver reports a behavior as 2.75, the raw score should be considered A. 0, B. 2, C. 3, or D. The raw score should not be used on the scoring worksheet. Question number 4. If the consistency check in section 3 of the scoring worksheet is not passed, you should A. Move on to section 4, B. Change the raw scores in section 2, C. Refer to appendix E, or D. Have the caregiver redo the caregiver response form. Question number 5. A SIDI scored between -10 and 10 indicates A. Pragmatic language development, B. Typical language development, C. Autism spectrum disorder, or D. Specific language impairment. The correct answer to question number 3 is B. 2. If a caregiver reports a discrepant rating, the score must round down to the lowest whole number. The score should not be left empty because 3 unrated statements make the CCC-2 void. The correct answer to question number 4 is C. Refer to appendix E. If the consistency check in section 3 is not passed, you should refer to appendix E to verify consistency. If it is still not passed, go back through and check that the raw scores were all copied down correctly onto the scoring worksheet and into the scoring CD. The correct answer to question number 5 is B. Typical language development. An SIDI between -10 and 10 indicates that the child has typical language development. Greater than 10 indicates a possible specific language impairment, and less than -11 indicates possible autism spectrum disorder. Thank you for listening today. We hope you gained insight about the Children's Communication Checklist 2.